There's no doubt there has been progress in getting children to school.
But those in the education sphere say there's still a long way to go. The organisation Section 27 has been campaigning for better education. They've also been monitoring political manifestos to see who's putting education front and centre. Matshidiso Lencoasa is a budget researcher at Section 27. Matshidiso, good evening. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. All of the political parties promised to improve education. Have any of them done the actual thinking required in their manifestos to do it?
So thank you very much for having me. To start off, it is true that education is paramount in the manifestos because education is quite a pertinent aspect of our country. It's a constitutionally protected right. And it affects so many people. And while we have made some progress, we still have a long way to go. So it is quite there is a political aspect to it. And of course, no political party is going to leave it off the agenda. However, as to whether they've considered all the aspects adequately, I'm quite skeptical of that. I think there are a lot of political promises that are being made, but there's questions about how feasible some of those promises are made, or there's not enough of the how is this going to be done? And that's more of the work that we do at Section 27, making sure that we actually bridge those promises, that litigation, that legislation into realized access to quality basic education for all.
Is it fair to say that our problems start right at the foundation phase? In other words, in a country where many people have to actually pay for the foundation phase, that's where we start to get it wrong.
Well, I actually think that it goes all the way back. So all the way from when, the child support grant, when children are born, in utero, actually supporting women who are pregnant, that has implications, making sure that there's adequate nutrition, supporting people who maybe cannot afford and rely on social support, making sure that there's protective mechanisms to ensure that the learners, that there's proper nutrition and other aspects that protect that. I know that the Department of Basic Education has recognized that ECD, early childhood development, there needs to be some intervention to strengthening it. And so there has been like the Bella Bill, making schoolifying grade R. So there are aspects of it just to support that there is recognition that it does start before we even get to grade 1, already at grade 1. If we're starting at grade 1, it could be too late.
I mean, one of the problems with education, it seems to me, is that the people involved, the children, can't really explain to you what's happening, whether they're getting a good education or not. So it's really difficult to assess. And isn't this a problem other education systems battle with as well? And maybe it's a problem for us, particularly when you have such huge inequality, between rural schools, urban schools. The racialized inequality, of course, is there. So does that make it quite difficult to know if we're improving or not? Because education takes a long time to assess.
It's true. And also, a lot of us realize the inequality of our education system and many of the shortcomings in hindsight once we've left that education system. However, there are other stakeholders who are really important in education attainment, including teachers, including school governing body or members, as well as people, even volunteers who work on the school nutrition program. All of those perspectives shape our understanding of realizing that actually, while we have made some progress, we still have an unequal education system in our country.
Now, the Bella Bill, which you just mentioned, makes it compulsory to make grade R compulsory. But it also proposes that it seeks to criminalize parents who don't take their children to school or ensure that their children are at school. How is that going to help, do you think?
Well, I think that, firstly, I do think that contrary to some of the some of the debates that have been had, there are some progressive measures that are being implemented, including that and other prospects that could advance education attainment. I definitely... on the one hand, yes, on paper, it sounds right because every child must have access to quality basic education, and parents shouldn't be in the way of that. But as to how that's going to be implemented, I'm open to seeing that, and that's where the deal breaker is. So much great policy, but what happens? How does that translate on the ground?
There's another thing education does, and Voya, I'm going to give away a secret here, I hope you don't mind, but when Voya and I went to school, which was a long time before you did, there were about 17 17 or 18 different matric exams. You know, there were different things, and the 4 provinces at the time, different groups wrote different things. I'm guessing, but by the time you went to school, there was really 1, maybe 2 matric exams. And what that has done, I'm hoping, what the education system needs to do is make us all more South African. It actually brings us all together because you're all studying the same thing. And you all grow up with the same set of facts. And this is crucially important. Of course, every community has their own understanding of their own history. But education, schools, makes us South African. Do you think it's doing that properly? And it's a big question, because I think schools in the Eastern Cape might well have the same syllabus as a school in Umlazi might well have the same syllabus as a school in Sandton. But I imagine where those children end up is still very different.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think it has to do with there are so many dynamics or so many aspects to adequate education quality. So on the one hand, we have issues like mother tongue learning. So if I bring it, I was actually speaking to my colleagues earlier that I once wrote an exam that was written in my home language, and I even thought I was cheating because I couldn't believe how much easier it was. And so it just showed me in hindsight that was a barrier to education and attainment. And so I think, yes, it is true, the education system, if we have a unified education system that makes us all truly South African, it can work, but we really do need to overcome some of those barriers, mother tongue learning, even things like eradicating pit latrine so that learners are not risking their lives to attain that education to enrich that proudly South African culture.
In fact, it reminds me of something that people talk a lot about, a child who goes to school in Sandton versus my cousin's child who goes to school in rural Eastern Cape, because when you hear such things as, 81% of grade 4 learners in South Africa, for instance, can't read, unable to read for meaning, then it becomes a frightening statistics. And then a lot of us then get to interpret that in all sorts of ways. In other words, the child who is in rural Eastern Cape who is not fluent in English is necessarily, getting a bad deal, compared to the child who is in Sandton. Is that indeed the case in reality?
It definitely is. And I mean, you're making an example of Sandton versus Eastern Cape, which is very stark and shows the inequality legacy in our education system. But even, for example, some provinces might not actually spend enough. There's issues of underspending for education. And so you have, for example, there have been examples of, I think, the Eastern Cape underspent in the infrastructure budget 1 year. And then in order to prevent that underspending, that money was allocated to a province that actually has the capacity to spend that money. And so you're seeing between Eastern Cape and KZN, it's both even like rural schools, but one has, because their government happens to be able to have the capacity to actually spend that money, they can solve one aspect, like they can eradicate this pit latrine, but the other learner is left behind. So yes, there is very, very worrying levels of inequality, and there are ways to overcome that, but I think that we're not moving fast enough in realizing that.
Matshidiso, so much more to talk about. Thank you very much indeed. Matshidiso Lencoasa is a budget researcher at Section 27.